Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, July 18th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Mountain West and Pac-12. It seemed like they were heading right towards a merger. There might be a little bit of a hurdle in that process in the next little bit, so we'll break down that for you guys. Then we'll get back into UGA and the traffic situation that has been happening with them, a ton of traffic violations over the last couple of years. We'll break down a new development in that and how it definitely changes the conversation just a little bit. Then we'll get into LSU and Brian Kelly. The last couple of jobs that Brian Kelly's had, year 3 has been just remarkable for him. We'll talk about whether or not it can be that way for LSU. Then we'll get into something that I'm sure you've heard about as a college football fan, what we call rat poison. And we'll talk about the 4 teams that are dealing with it the most and how they can kind of combat that going into the 2024 season. Then we'll get into a hot take Thursday, and I'll talk about coaching expectations in college football and how, frankly, I think they're just kind of broken and no one really has a good idea of what is actually supposed to be expected of their head coach. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, please do. Again, that's gsmcspodcast.net. But let's jump in and let's talk about the Mountain West and Pac-12, because this is something that has been kind of talked about for quite some time. Pac-12 and its 2 members at this point, the Pac-2, Oregon State and Washington State could be ending up in the Mountain West. That is something that has kind of been picking up steam really ever since the Pac-12 kind of disbanded last season. They had an agreement with the Mountain West to do some scheduling over there, and people just kind of assumed that was going to be the way that things went, that either the Pac-12 was going to take some Mountain West teams or the Pac-12 was just going to join the Mountain West, and that would be that. So that has kind of just been the going theory for quite some time, and we've kind of pinpointed some Mountain West teams that could possibly join Oregon State and Washington State, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be as clean-cut of an answer as we once thought. And Dennis Dodd did a really good breakdown of this, talking about Pac-12 media days and how there was a ton of things that came out of that made him feel not super confident in that Mountain West and Pac-12 merger between the two. So it'll be really interesting to watch this, but one of the things he pointed to was the college football playoff agreement, and the Mountain West, frankly, is in a very good spot when you talk about that agreement. They really were, when you talk about the group of 5 teams, were definitely towards the top of the distribution and will be for quite some time, because they're going to get a team in there very, very often, whether it's Boise State or UNLV or Utah State or Colorado State. They're going to get someone into that dance a lot of the time. Obviously, the American is another fantastic conference, but Mountain West is very, very high on that list. And the question is, does Oregon State and Washington State, do they boost that enough? Do they make that big of a different conversation, especially with a lot of the different stuff happening around the country, with Clemson and Florida State possibly going to the Big 12 and some of the different changes? Does that really change the negotiations that much? Does that give you a bigger piece of the pie? Because frankly, I would argue it really kind of doesn't. But the reality is this is a very, very good conference. And this is a conference that is in a really, really good spot. So maybe it's not worth adding an Oregon State or a Washington State to this conversation and kind of muddying the waters a little bit, even if you're with not really a huge payoff financially from at least the college football playoff. And then continuing on here, obviously, he talked about the kind of addition of what the revenue could possibly look like for the Mountain West if they were to combine with all of these Pac-12 teams, and it said it would only be about a 10 to 15% increase. And the question about that is, it doesn't necessarily change much when you get into television negotiations. The whole thing about these TV contracts and how important it is to nail these TV contracts is you need as many big faces in the room. You need as many big players in the room that can kind of wield a lot of power. I'm not sure Oregon State and Washington State add this, monstrous thing to what the Mountain West has right now. I think they add a little bit because they were a Power 5 schools not too long ago, but if you look at the financial aspect, if you look at a lot of these things, if you take away the absolute war chest that the Pac-12 has set up for themselves over the next little bit, there's not really much that separates a Oregon State from a Boise State or a Washington State from a Fresno State. So I think that's the biggest thing here where, yeah, you would get a 10 to 15% increase hypothetically, but does it really make that big of a difference? And does that 10 or 15% increase not mean anything because the SEC is getting 20 more percent and the Big 10 is getting 15 more percent, and all of that stuff can kind of be happening around you that makes this kind of just a headache that's not worth going down. And then finally, I think one of the big things here is the Mountain West just kind of wanting to stay pat. They have done a really, really good job of kind of just being their own entity and kind of standing alone, especially in the Group of Five realm. They're kind of one of the conferences we look at most aggressively, and I think that's going to be one of the very interesting things. And on top of that, it goes into kind of this conversation of what is your brand power? What is your name power? And the Mountain West, obviously, right this second, is not necessarily quite as powerful as the Pac-12, but in a year, it definitely could be. In 6 months, it definitely could be. So I think that's the big question here is, if you're the Mountain West and you want to merge with these two schools, maybe you want to take the Pac-12 logo, maybe you want to take their name, but maybe at the end of the day, you want to just keep what's yours. You want to stay pat and you want to kind of expand that brand that you've already done a really, really good job of expanding, at least at the Group of Five level. So that'll be a really, really fascinating thing to watch. We talked about that kind of war chest, that $265 million that Oregon State and Washington State have kind of built up from Pac-12 payments, from CFP, from everything in between. Over the next, I believe, 10 years is when all of this is going to start to really come in. And the question is that really worth getting into another conference? And this kind of goes the other direction of Oregon State and Washington State going out and getting some of these Mountain West teams, like possibly a team like Boise State obviously would be at the very top of that list. And the question is, you have this huge amount of money right this second. You would have to go out and probably pay at least $18 million, possibly up to $36 million for all of these teams to leave, for each one of these teams to leave, But if you're going to do that and you're going to add 6 teams, let's say, that's upwards of about $200 million, upwards of $200 million there of your 265. Is that worth it for Oregon State and Washington State? And if it's not, which I would argue that it's almost definitely not, then would you just join the Mountain West? Would you just take what they have to offer? Would you take their brand and kind of move forward that way? So that's going to be a really, really interesting thing to watch, because for a really long time, we've been talking about the Pac-12 as really setting themselves up in a much better position than we thought they would be in, and kind of being in a position where so many options are open to them. But the reality is, as that money starts to go down, as that $265 million becomes $200 million, becomes $150, becomes $100, you lose power, and you lose it relatively quickly, because that's your clock. You know exactly how long you have, and it's how long it takes to spend that $265 million is how long you have to figure out all of this stuff. So that's kind of the question that they're under. You know, how quickly can we figure all this out, and where do we want to go? Do they want to be a Mountain West program? Do they want to be those two teams in the Mountain West and kind of boost it just a little bit, but not necessarily help it too much? And is the Mountain West interested in that? Because they would likely have to pay some certain type of money and get involved in different types of things that might not be worth the headache. And obviously that's not the greatest thing for those two schools. And absolutely, I've been firmly a part of the team that has really wanted them to be a part of a big time conference again. But the reality is, I wanted that because I like these two schools, and I like seeing Oregon State and Washington State face off, and I like seeing them on national television. It doesn't necessarily play into who they are as brands and who they are on the football field and all of those different things. So while, I would love it, and while I think it would be a great thing to keep these two schools intact in the national conversation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are worth keeping intact. And I hate to say that, obviously, because I love Oregon State and I love Washington State, but the reality is the Pac-12 brand is the last kind of piece of this, and it doesn't really hold that much weight anymore. Now, it does hold a little bit of weight because it used to be a Power 5 conference, but when you walk into these rooms with ESPN, with Fox, they are very much focused on what are you bringing to the table? What can we sell of yours that is valuable to us? And 9 times out of 10, the most valuable thing for a conference is that name, is the SEC, the Big Ten. When you can slap that on any promotional thing, you're going to get a lot of eyes because there's a lot of people that care about those conferences. The Pac 12 can't really say the same thing. And they could, a year ago, they could 2 years ago. But the reality is how quickly everything happened and all the change that is happening and kind of the weird nature with which they're kind of sitting in the shadows right now. When they walk into that room with an ESPN executive or with a Fox executive, I'm not sure they're sitting there and saying, wow, we really want the Pac 12 to be across our billboards and be all across our pages, because it doesn't really mean too much. So the Pac 12 was in a position where you felt like they kind of had a ton of options open to them, but it doesn't change that they were in very low leverage positions. It doesn't change that they were kind of grasping at straws, and they kind of still are to a certain extent. And the Pac 12 in general is trying to figure out, what's the best way forward? Do we just merge with the Mountain West if they let us merge with them? Do we beg the Big 12 to let us join the ACC? I don't know what it looks like, but frankly, when I look at the Pac 12 right now, as you see that $265 million war chest, or whatever you want to call it, as you see that start to fall, things get more and more dire down there. So I absolutely love to see Oregon State and Washington State in a big-time conference again, but frankly, I don't think it's going to be under the Pac-12 name. I don't think they hold enough weight in the conversations that they need to hold weight in for it to matter. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch. Obviously, that amount of money will have a ton to do with it. So as time kind of rolls on, that money will slowly go down and things get a little bit more sketchy for those two teams. So it'll be fascinating to watch that, obviously, and definitely a very, very interesting thing to kind of unpack, because 2 years ago the Pac-12 was upright and standing, and in 6 months it could be tipped right over. So it'll be a really, really interesting thing to watch. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about UGA and the traffic violations that have been happening at that school. We're going to talk about a new development that Kirby Smart let us in on that definitely does change the conversation just a little bit. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.